Changing of the guard in South Vietnam. The United States also developed a security relationship with the non-communist government of South Vietnam, with the end of French control over Indochina. Political movements in Tonkin, southern Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia established separate governments. The temporary dividing line at the 17th parallel between Ho Chi Minh's communists and the non-communist Vietnamese to the south began to take on permanence. Ngo Dinh Diem, a fervent anti-communist and reportedly celibate Catholic, took power in Saigon as the head of a new Republic of Vietnam. Diem was born in Quang Binh Province in 1901, the son of a high official in the court of the Vietnamese Emperor Hue. Coming from a well-connected Mandarin family, and based on his own intellectual gifts, Diem easily climbed the educational ladder, graduating at the top of his class from the prestigious School of Law and Public Administration in Hanoi. He was appointed a provincial governor at the age of 25. In this capacity, he oversaw the suppression in 1929 of a communist uprising and thereafter considered himself anti-communist in his political leanings. He also became fervently anti-French when colonial officials denied him any real authority as Emperor Bao Dai's Minister of the Interior and threatened to arrest him when he resigned in protest in 1933. The communists abducted him on the way, spirited him off to a village near the border with China, and held him for 6 months, during which time he contracted malaria. Fearing for his life, Diem left Vietnam in 1950 and spent the next 4 years at seminaries in New Jersey and in Europe. Naval vessels of the Vietnam Nav-Y operate on a tributary of the Mekong River in the early 1960s. President Diem, U.S. Ambassador Elbridge Durbrow, and Vice Admiral Charles D. Griffin, Commander 7th Fleet, meet in October 1960 when cruiser St. Paul, CA-73, made a port call to Saigon. Washington used such diplomatic events to show support for Diem. While in the United States, he made contact with Francis Cardinal Spellman, Supreme Court Justice William O. Douglas, Junior Senator John F. Kennedy, and other prominent political figures. He reaffirmed his anti-communist and anti-French inclinations. These contacts would soon pay off for him. In June 1954, Emperor Bao Dai, aware of Diem's gifts as a leader, strong anti-communist credentials, and high-powered American friends, appointed him prime minister. Diem moved quickly and effectively to consolidate his power in the South. Employing Vietnamese ground and naval units, he crushed the Binh Xuyen criminal gang in Saigon and the armed religious groups Chow Dai and Hoa Hao, chased out Viet Minh officials, and engineered a referendum in which he received an inflated 98% of the vote. With the support of the Eisenhower administration, he refused to sponsor national elections, as called for in the Geneva Agreement, because he feared that Ho Chi Minh's communists would dominate the process and end his political existence, as Diem in the South and Ho in the North consolidated their political control. American advisors worked to replace French forces. All French troops had departed Vietnam by June 1955, with a modern South Vietnamese military arm. Influenced by the Korean War experience, U.S. Army trainers prepared the new 150,000-man Army of the Republic of Vietnam, ARVN, to repel a conventional communist invasion across the 17th parallel. Disregarding what the French had learned the hard way about warfare in Indochina, the Americans gave much less attention to preparing their charges for counter-guerrilla warfare than did the French. The Vietnam Navy, VNN, organized and equipped by the French, received the attention of American naval advisors who focused on developing forces for open ocean, coastal, and river operations. During the late 1950s, the Americans handled the transfer to the VNN of landing ships and craft, trained Vietnamese sailors, and observed their operations. As with many newly formed military organizations, the VNN lacked experienced officers, adequately trained bluejackets, and suitable equipment. The French had provided the VNN with American-made vessels left over from World War II, and after years of hard use, these units were in poor shape. The recipient of almost $2 billion in American aid during the last half of the 1950s, Diem instituted measures to strengthen his political base in the South. Almost 3/4 of this assistance was devoted to the armed forces and security in general. Diem pushed the development of Vietnamese settlements in the Central Highlands and a road system that he hoped would promote national cohesion. Diem's government successfully managed the influx of over 1 million mostly Catholic refugees from the north. The government cleared land for the newcomers, built them villages, dams. Diem also pursued land reform in the Mekong Delta that redistributed much of the land to more than half of the tenant farmers. But a sizable minority still paid exorbitant rents to absentee landlords, and all had to endure frustrating bureaucratic red tape in the process. South Vietnam's rice production increased from 2.6 million tons in 1954 to 5 million tons in 1959, and rubber production increased by 1/3. Like Chiang Kai-shek and Syngman Rhee, Diem was an authoritarian Asian leader who treated opponents harshly and endeavored to manage the political process. He was not a liberal Democrat. He asserted firm control of political life in the capital, exposed coup plotters, and between 1955 and 1958 dispatched troops against Communist Party cells in the cities and in the countryside and denounced the communist campaigns. Government forces killed thousands of communists and imprisoned many more. One study published in Hanoi after the Vietnam War credited Diem's campaigns with reducing Communist Party membership in the South by 90% during the period. On Diem's visits to the United States and during visits to Saigon by Senator Lyndon Johnson and other American political leaders, Diem was lionized as the great hope of the free world in Southeast Asia. Senator John Kennedy opined that South Vietnam was the cornerstone of the free world in Southeast Asia, the keystone to the arch, the finger in the dike. In 1958, as the peoples of former French Indochina enjoyed a temporary respite from the bloodletting of previous years, Mao again raised the temperature in the Western Pacific to divert domestic attention from the Great Leap Forward, an economic and social program that had proven disastrous to the lives of millions of his people. Mao ordered the shelling of nationalist-held Quemoy and Mazu Islands. Thousands of artillery rounds cascaded down on the heads of Chiang soldiers on Quemoy, located only a few miles from the mainland. Nationalist vessels were unable to resupply the island's defenders. It would be only a matter of time before the nationalists there would have to surrender, determined to prevent the communists from seizing Quemoy, or worse, invading Taiwan itself. Eisenhower ordered the concentration in Chinese waters of 5 carriers whose aircraft were equipped to drop nuclear bombs. At that time, American leaders were much more inclined than later to consider the use of such weapons, even in tactical situations. Washington then ordered U.S. warships to escort nationalist supply ships to Quemoy, faced with the prospect of nuclear war with the United States. And absent Soviet support, Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev implied to Mao that the Chinese were on their own. Mao forbade his forces from attacking the American ships. Although shelling continued, on odd days, the communists allowed resupply. Convoys to reach the island untouched on even days. U.S. Ambassador Frederick Knowlton greets Admiral Harry D. Felt, Commander-in-Chief, Pacific Command, as the officer arrives in Saigon. This was a tacit admission by Mao that his action to embarrass the U.S. nationalist allies had failed. The crisis soon ebbed. American leaders became convinced that Mao and his communist allies were determined to pursue a new, more belligerent approach toward their neighbors. Typical of the views expressed were those of Admiral Herbert G. Hopwood, Commander-in-Chief, U.S. Pacific Fleet. We are entering a new era of intensified cold and limited war in South and Southeast Asia. The Chickums previously attempted to win friends and influence the new and violently nationalistic governments in this area. They have now decided to use force and/or threat of force as a major instrument of policy. Washington was determined to counter the communists by providing governments and parties in the region with political, economic, and military assistance. There were no easy choices with regard to friendly governments or leaders. The United States helped preserve the independence of South Korea, Taiwan, and the Philippines during the Cold War, but to do so required doing business with a succession of dictators and other odious figures. The same applied in Indochina. At one point, during a long confrontation in Laos, Admiral Harry D. Felt, Commander-in-Chief, Pacific Command, CINCPAC, expressed his regret that the leader of the government in the capital of Vientiane was no George Washington. He added, however, that he is anti-communist, which is what counts most in the sad Laos situation. Hancock, CVA-19, one of 5 carriers, along with escorting cruisers and destroyers, deployed off China during the Taiwan Strait crisis of 1958. Admiral Arleigh Burke, Chief of Naval Operations, with Secretary of the Nav, Thomas S. Gates, Jr. Naval leaders expressed concern during 1959 that China and North Vietnam were becoming increasingly aggressive in Southeast Asia. Hanoi opens the campaign for South Vietnam and Laos. In May 1959, Ho Chi Minh, with Chinese support, decided on a campaign of armed struggle to unify all Vietnam. The North Vietnamese also intended to dominate the Indo-Chinese peninsula and facilitate the establishment of Marxist-Leninist governments in Laos and Cambodia. The Communists had solidified their control of the North Vietnamese population and feared that if they waited too long, Diem would do the same in the South. Indeed, Diem had already imprisoned or killed thousands of communists in the Republic of Vietnam, as well as many other non-communist political opponents. That month, Hanoi began returning to South Vietnam. Via southern Laos, communists who had gone north in 1954. During 1959 and 1960, for 1,500, communist cadres made their way south over what came to be known as the Ho Chi Minh Trail. They linked up with their southern brethren and soon formed the National Liberation Front of South Vietnam, the military arm of which was commonly referred to by the South Vietnamese and Americans as the Viet Cong, to help secure the route through southern Laos. Hanoi provided Laotian communists, the Pathet, Lao, who were already locked in conflict with the anti-communist government in Vientiane, with military advisors, weapons, and supplies. A Soviet airlift provided the Pathet Lao with arms, ammunition, and equipment. Aircraft carrier Bennington, CVS-20, and destroyer Alfred A. Cunningham, DD-752, refuel from Fleet Oiler Maspilian, AO-105, while underway. Vietnam Nav Y sailors stand by in Saigon as guided missile cruiser Oklahoma City, CLG-5, flagship of the U.S. 7th Fleet, pulls into port for a show the flag visit in July 1964. These diplomatic events increased along with U.S. concern for the security situation in Southeast Asia. In 1959 and 1960, the Pathet Lao launched major attacks against government forces. In each instance, 7th Fleet Carrier and amphibious task forces deployed into the South China Sea in a show of force. These visible demonstrations of U.S. resolve helped persuade the Pathet Lao to cease their attacks and agree to ceasefire negotiations with Vientiane. It took more than that in May of 1962 when the Pathet Lao overran a government-held town and threatened to topple the pro-American government of Laos. President John F. Kennedy ordered the deployment into Thailand of major U.S. forces and their movement forward to the border with Laos. The 3rd Marine Expeditionary Brigade, which included sizable infantry, air, and Seabee components and a U.S. Army infantry regiment, were prepared to enter Laos and fight the Laotian communists. Backing up these American ground forces ashore were aircraft carriers Hancock, CVA-19, and Bennington, CVS-20, persuaded that the United States would not allow a communist takeover in Laos. The Pathet Lao and their Soviet, Chinese, and North Vietnamese supporters agreed to a compromise. In Geneva, Switzerland, on 23 July 1962, the contending Laotian parties agreed to join in a coalition government. The United States and North Vietnam pledged to withdraw their military forces from Laos and respect the country's neutrality, a pledge kept by neither country. U.S. Marines storm ashore on the coast of North Borneo in May 1961 as part of SEATO exercise Pony Express. Meanwhile, to bolster friendly governments concerned about the growing militancy of the communist nations, Washington dramatically increased the U.S. Navy's presence in Southeast Asia. In the early 60s, American warships made port calls in South Vietnam, Thailand, Indonesia, and even Cambodia, whose capital was far up the Mekong River at Phnom Penh. Numerous multinational exercises took place, including Pony Express off Borneo that involved 60 ships and 26,000 sailors and Marines from SEATO member states. Naval, air, and logistic bases blossomed in the Philippines and on Okinawa. Many American leaders, including members of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, thought that remote, undeveloped Laos was a poor place to fight the communists, especially if China intervened there in force. There was much greater support for making a stand in Thailand and South Vietnam, both of which had access to the sea and the naval power of the United States. U.S. naval assistance to South Vietnam. Even as Washington had focused on developments in Laos, the Military Assistance Advisory Group, Vietnam redoubled its efforts to create viable South Vietnamese armed forces. The MAG's Navy section doubled in strength between 1959 and 1964, partly reflecting the growth in the Vietnam Navy from 5,000 officers and men to more than 8,000. By late 1964, the United States was supporting a Vietnamese naval arm of 44 seagoing ships and over 200 landing craft, patrol boats, and other vessels. The largest units in the VNN were Sea Force Escorts, PCEs, motor gunboats, PGMs, large support landing ships, LSSLs, large infantry landing ships, LSILs, medium landing ships, LSMs, and tank landing ships, LSTs, that operated in the South China Sea and the Gulf of Siam. The VNN inherited from the French not only combatants, but a concept of river warfare built around the Dynasot or River Assault Division, which had provided the French with a measure of success against the Viet Minh when operating with strong ground forces. The French Dynasot sometimes decimated Viet Minh guerrilla units prevented from escape by land or water, guided by the Dinosaur concept. The Vietnamese formed river assault groups, RAGs, of armed and armored landing craft that transported troops, escorted convoys of rice boats, swept for mines, and provided gunfire support to ground units. The 102-man, 20-boat RAGs operated from bases at Saigon, My Tho, Vinh Long, Can Tho, and Long Xuyen. The RAGs were critical not only to the Vietnamese government's military control in the almost roadless Mekong Delta south of Saigon, but to the political and economic well-being of the region. Life along a river in the Mekong Delta. The people who lived in this region, the most heavily populated in the country, depended on its myriad rivers and canals for their most basic needs. Control of these vital waterways was critical to the South Vietnamese government survival. Petty Officer First Class Carl L. Scott, a coastal force advisor armed with a Thompson submachine gun, returns with the men of his unit from a raid against the Viet Song. A converted LCM monitor and 3 SDCN patrol craft of the Vietnam NAV Wise 25th River Assault Group prepare to depart their base at Can Tho for an operation on the Ba Sac River. U.S. NAVY advisors and Vietnamese workers inspect a coastal force junk that will soon join the anti-infiltration patrol. Effort offshore. The Navy of the Republic of Vietnam, with the encouragement of American advisors, established another component, the paramilitary coastal force. The mission of that force was to patrol the 200-mile coast of South Vietnam in search of vessels trying to infiltrate arms, ammunition, couriers, and other special cargo from North Vietnam. The coastal force consisted of a fleet of 600 specially built wooden junks that operated from 28 austere bases established all along the South Vietnamese littoral. Vietnamese and American naval officers coordinated operations from coastal surveillance centers strategically positioned at Da Nang in the north, Cam Ranh on the central coast, Vung Tau southeast of Saigon, and in Doyon Phu Quoc, a large island in the Gulf of Siam. From the end of the French Indochina War to 1964, the American naval advisors were most effective in facilitating the transfer to the VNN of ships, aircraft, and other equipment and establishing bases and supply depots. The Co-Vans, as the Vietnamese referred to them, however, were much less effective at influencing their counterparts to adopt American operational and tactical approaches. Few naval advisors could speak Vietnamese or fully comprehend Asian culture. Having already led naval forces for years and expecting to fight for many more years, Vietnamese naval officers were less inclined than their short-term American counterparts to seek quick but potentially costly results on a battlefield. Captain William Hardcastle, head of the Naval Advisory Group in 1964 and early 1965, recognized that his advisors were enthusiastic and dedicated to the mission but lacked practical experience. They came from a Navy focused on defeating the Soviet fleet in major battles far out to sea, not working with small boats in the green water and brown water environs of South Vietnam. Despite this and other deficiencies, Hardcastle believed that his advisors would in time improve the operational effectiveness and fighting ability of the VNN. There was then not much positive reinforcement for that rosy vision. The VNN was plagued with problems, including a lack of resources for training and operations, a secondary status in relation to the much larger army of Vietnam, and poorly motivated personnel. Low pay and austere living conditions caused many Vietnamese sailors to desert. But the greatest drawback to the development of the Navy and the other South Vietnamese armed forces was the involvement of their officers in plots, coups, and other political intrigues. During much of this period, the Navy fared well because it sided with the winners. For instance, the naval service helped DM suppress several religious sects in the mid-1950s. Captain Ho Tan Nguyen, VNN naval deputy, backed DM in the coup attempt of November 1960, when two rebel Air Force pilots attacked the presidential palace in February 1962. Naval forces shot down one attacking plane, and Nguyen offered to establish a command post in the Navy Yard for DM. A naval advisor, Lieutenant Dale C. Meyercord. Lieutenant Dale C. Meyercord, right? And Lieutenant Commander Tom Wooten on the bow of a Vietnam Navy combatant. Lieutenant Meyercord strikes a thoughtful pose among the sailors of the River Assault Group he is advising. In his inaugural address to the nation on January 1961, President John F. Kennedy assured listeners worldwide that he and his fellow Americans would pay any price, bear any burden, meet any hardship, support any friend, oppose any foe, in order to assure the survival and the success of liberty. Navy Lieutenant Dale C. Meyercord, like many of his compatriots, answered that clarion call and enlisted in the fight to defeat the communist insurgency tearing apart the Republic of Vietnam. The 1960 graduate of Officer Candidate School told his mother that he had volunteered for Vietnam service because a lot is going on there that will eventually change the world. Once he had completed Vietnamese language training, finishing first in his class, Meyercord was assigned as senior advisor to the Vietnam Navy's River Assault Group, RAG-23, based at Vinh Long, deep in the heart of South Vietnam's Mekong Delta. The young officer and two Navy chiefs who comprised the small advisory detachment understood that the success of their mission would depend partly on their ability to earn the support of the local population for the South Vietnamese Navy. Meyercord established good relations with area villagers. They appreciated his mastery of the Vietnamese language. He told them that the RAG would help protect them from Viet Cong guerrilla attacks and provide them medical and other government assistance. Meyercord and the other U.S. naval advisors in Vietnam were unique as individual human beings, the product of distinct backgrounds and assigned to differ in South Vietnamese units, operational environments, and commanders. But there were common threads too. Most of the early advisors found their understanding of the Vietnamese language and culture inadequate for their assignment and had to learn on the job. Whether assigned to the VNN units on the coast, the major rivers, or the Mekong Delta border with Cambodia, the Americans often lived in rudimentary huts or hutches. They had to endure the heat and humidity of tropical Vietnam and subsist on a diet of rice and vegetables, usually flavored with nuoc mam, a pungent sauce made for fermented fish. Many American advisors found it a challenge to adapt the U.S. Navy's concepts of combat leadership, command and control, logistics, and maintenance to the VNN's more basic approaches. While less intent on seeking battle with the enemy than Meyercord and other young, AGRA's Civ American advisors, Vietnamese officers and men rose to the occasion when necessary and fought with courage and determination. Meyercord's most pressing responsibility in late 1964 and early 1965, when the communists mounted a serious countrywide offensive against the government in Saigon, was to help RAG-23 defeat the enemy around Vinh Long. Meyercord and the River Assault Group fought over 30 actions with Viet Cong forces in the period. Lieutenant Meyercord was the modern embodiment of hard-fighting naval warriors of the past. His radio call sign was, appropriately, Hornblower after C.S. Forrester's brave and daring fictional character. In numerous battles, Meyercord displayed personal bravery, coolness under fire, and professional skill. In one action, he helped direct artillery support, called in air strikes, and facilitated evacuation of wounded South Vietnamese sailors. When the calm, Mondang officer of RAG-23 was hit in another action, Meyercord successfully directed the battle even though he was himself wounded. In his final action, on March 16, 1965, Meyercord positioned himself, as he always did, on the raised deckhouse of a South Vietnamese combat vessel. He believed an officer should inspire his men by example. Without warning, the enemy sprang a devastating ambush on the river assault group. Wounded, Meyercord fired back at his assailants, but he was struck by another round that mortally wounded him. Lieutenant Dale C. Meyercord, posthumously awarded the Navy Cross for his leadership, battle skill, and personal courage, was the first U.S. naval officer killed in action in South Vietnam. He would be an inspiration for the thousands of naval advisors who followed him. U.S. naval advisors inspect the base at Indoi on the island of Phu Quoc in the Gulf of Siam. From left to right, Captain Joseph B. Drachnik, Chief of the Naval Advisory Group, Vietnam. Lieutenant Wesley A. Hawk, 4th Coastal District Advisor, an unidentified U.S. naval officer, and Captain William H. Hardcastle, Drachnik's successor. DM. In recognition of his loyalty, DM promoted Gwynn to captain shortly thereafter, hoping to enlist Gwynn to the cause of overthrowing DM on November 1, 1963. A naval officer involved in the plot invited to drive the captain to a party in honor of his birthday. En route, when Gwynn refused to join the conspiracy, the officer put 3 bullets in the man's head and then drove to naval headquarters, where he arrested the Navy staff. In the aftermath of the coup that resulted in the assassination of DM and his brother, the primary criteria for leadership of the Navy became political reliability rather than operational skill or bravery in combat. When Rear Admiral Henry S. Persons from the SINPAC staff inspected the VNN in November 1961, he found many problems with the naval service. He determined that poor maintenance and repair prevented 2/3 of the patrol ships and half of the river vessels from conducting operations. He discovered that too many naval officers lacked combat experience, adequate professional preparation, and the drive to succeed as leaders. The enlisted force SUF feared from lack of adequate training. A major problem was the failure of the Army-dominated Joint General Staff to devote sufficient resources to the Navy. Captain Philip S. Bucklew, dispatched to South Vietnam early in 1964 by Admiral Felt, SINPAC, found many of the same problems. He credited the Vietnamese naval service with making gains in some critical operational areas since 1961, but concluded that much work remained to be done. By 1964, it was clear that the communists were infiltrating guerrillas and supplies into the South from the sea and via the rivers, canals, and other waterways between South Vietnam and Cambodia. Bucklew was especially troubled by the VNN's inability to stem the flow of sampans laden with arms, ammunition, and supplies into the Mekong Delta region. He strongly urged Washington to increase material support and training of the Vietnamese Navy to improve its operational performance along the coast and especially in the Mekong Delta. He advocated more robust coastal and river warfare units and the employment of barricades, curfews, checkpoints, and patrols. Commander Ho Tan Nguyen, acting naval deputy of the Vietnam NAVY, Left and Rear Admiral Alfred Jeward, Commander Cruiser Division 1, during an official funk tie-in in October of 1959. Nguyen's loyalty to DM ultimately led to the naval officer's death. U.S. Naval Advisor Lieutenant Thomas Howley observes a Vietnamese naval officer training his men to operate a 20mm deck gun. President John F. Kennedy walks briskly along the flight deck of Oriskany, CVA-34, during a fleet visit in June 1963. Kennedy was a strong advocate of counterinsurgency warfare as a response to communist wars of national liberation. The U.S. Navy and counterinsurgency warfare. Although disappointed with the depth and pace of improvement of the VNN, in the early 1960s, few American naval leaders or advisors were ready to give up. This was an era of boundless optimism in the power and influence of the United States. U.S. military leaders were confident that counterinsurgency, their answer to the communist world's wars of national liberation, would strengthen America's Southeast Asian allies for the fight. The counterinsurgency approach evolved from the U.S. national security establishment's flexible response concept of the late 1950s that called for measured and appropriate responses to communist actions. For instance, a Soviet nuclear attack would be answered by U.S. nuclear retaliation. But the action of Viet Cong guerrillas to destabilize a rural district by killing local government officials would be countered by arming militia forces to defend the people and hunt the insurgents in the jungle. Successes during the 1950s and early 1960s by the anti-communist governments in the Philippines and Malaya against insurgent movements suggest to American leaders that counterinsurgency warfare will be a valid antidote to the challenges in Indochina. British analyst Sir Robert Thomson and other experts shared with the Americans their views of which aspects of counterinsurgency warfare worked and which ones did not. Based on the expiry in Malaya, NAVY SEAL and Marine advisors observed South Vietnamese sailors prepare for special operations with the coastal force. Influenced by these success stories, the Kennedy administration wholeheartedly endorsed ambitious programs to develop and deploy to South Vietnam and other nations threatened by communist insurgencies military personnel trained to fight guerrillas and win the support of local peoples for their governments. The U.S. Army's Special Forces troops, the Green Berets, soon became recognized symbols of America's counterinsurgency warfare establishment. Admiral Arleigh Burke was the first Chief of Naval Operations, CNO, to push seriously for the development of Navy Special Forces suited to counterinsurgency warfare. Under his guidance, during 1961, the Navy studied the use of 60-man teams of naval warriors to operate at sea, in the air, and on land against communist guerrillas and to train Allied forces for special warfare. With the personal encouragement of President Kennedy, on January 1st, 1962, the Navy established SEAL Team 1 in the Pacific Fleet and SEAL Team 2 in the Atlantic Fleet. During the next several years, SEALs deployed to Vietnam and worked to develop South Vietnamese Naval Commandos, LDNN, Lean Doc Nuoi Naya, U.S. NAV, YCBs, members of a CB Technical Assistance Team, sink a well in a Vietnamese village as its inhabitants look on with anticipation. Chief of Naval Operations Admiral Arleigh Burke, right foreground during an inspection of a Norwegian-built Nasty-class Special Operations boat. Burke was instrumental in the development of enhanced naval special warfare forces and equipment. The Navy also created specialized CB construction units to help the government of South Vietnam in the support of its people by building village fortifications, schools, hospitals, bridges, and roads. The unit's CB Technical Assistance Teams, or STATs, also built fortified camps on the border with Cambodia for U.S. Army Special Forces A-teams and affiliated Montagnard, Hill tribesmen, Chinese, and Vietnamese irregular troops. In this same vein, the Navy configured two of its Korean War aeromotor torpedo boats for Antigua, guerrilla warfare, and bought from Norway 6 modern Nasty-class PT boats. The 80-foot-long Nasty boats, diesel-powered and fiberglass-hulled, were capable of 41-knot speeds. The American and Norwegian boats were classified fast patrol boats, PTFs, armed with 20 and 40 millimeter guns and recoilless rifles, and dispatched to the Far East. The PDF force was intended to bombard enemy coastal facilities and infiltrate saboteurs from the sea. Finally, the Naval Service reconfigured Subma, Rhines Perch, APSS 313, and Celian, APSS 315, for special operations missions. The undersea vessels were ready to land SEALs, Green Berets, and South Vietnamese naval commandos behind enemy lines, gather intelligence, and rescue aviators shot down in hostile waters. The U.S. Army Special Forces camp at Binh Ton Thon, located in the Mekong Delta, a few miles from Cambodia. Seabees helped build this and other camps from which special forces patrolled the border areas of South Vietnam. Ocean minesweepers like Pledge, MSO 492, formed the core of the U.S. NAV WISE anti-infiltration patrol east of the 17th parallel during 1961 and 1962. U.S. naval forces joined the fight. The NAVY has traditionally stressed that its ships, aircraft, and weapons should be capable of performing many different tasks rather than single missions. Hence, when the Kennedy administration called for measures to combat the communist insurgency in South Vietnam, U.S., naval leaders knew that conventional units could fill the bill in limited partnership with the Republic of Vietnam Armed Forces. In that vein, on December 11, 1961, Corps TKV-41, an aircraft ferry operated by the NAV WISE Military Sea Transportation Service, DELIV, aired to Saigon helicopters of the Army's 8th and 57 transportation companies, light helicopter. These units would immeasurably improve the mobility and reach of South Vietnamese ground forces. 1 month later, aircraft ferry card, TKV-40, deployed Army helicopters to Da Nang. In April 1962, Marine aviation units joined the fray when amphibious assault ship Princeton, LPH-5, deployed the 259 officers and enlisted men and 24 H-34D helicopters of Marine Medium Helicopter Squadron, HMM, 362 to SOC Trang, an old Japanese airstrip in the Mekong Delta. By the end of the Long War in Vietnam, the helicopter would come to symbolize the American way of war. Concerned that the North Vietnamese were infill, trotting arms, and other munitions into South Vietnam BC, in December 1961 the U.S. Navy deployed ocean minesweepers and Martin SP, 5B Marlin. Imange, Army military police vehicles depart through the main gate of Headquarters Support Activity, Saigon. HSCS, a NAVY administrative and logistical command, provided services to armed forces members, their families, and U.S. government. Civilians in South Vietnam during the early 1960s. Imange, an Air Force officer shops in early 1965 at one of the Saz-run commissaries in South Vietnam. Seaplanes in a joint USNVNN surface and air patrol of the waters between the 17th parallel and the Paracel Islands. The two navies mounted a similar patrol in the Gulf of Siam. They're the U.S. Navy employed destroyer escorts. The VNN received valuable training in open ocean operations during the 7-month-long joint operation. But, despite stopping and search, ING thousands of suspicious vessels, the Allied navies discovered no appreciable communist infiltration. Ironically, soon after Washington ended the patrol operation on August 1, 1962, Hanoi inaugurated a major seaborne infiltration program. Even though the Navy ended its anti-infiltration patrol, U.S. conventional and special operations forces continued to flow into South Vietnam in the early 1960s. In keeping with a global division of labor among the American Armed Services, the Defense Department tasked the Navy with providing certain types of logistical and administrative support to U.S. personnel in the Republic of Vietnam. By the end of 1964, when there were 23,000 American military personnel and 2,700 U.S. government civilians in South Vietnam, the Navy's headquarters support activity, Saigon, SAS, was the primary command for their in-country support. The 600 personnel who staffed SAS provided medical and dental services at the Saigon Station Hospital, arranged rest and recupera, tie-in, R&R, flights, sponsored USO shows, oversaw in-country exchange stores, transported supplies throughout the country, and managed 32 quarters for transit officers and enlisted personnel. Members of the Navy Nurse Corps carried out their vital services at the Saigon Station Hospital in an environment fraught with danger. Throughout 1964, Viet Cong assassinations and bombings rocked Saigon. As a reflection of this reality, Captain Archie C. Kuntz, commander of SAS, awarded 3 Navy nurses Purple Heart medals for wounds they received while caring for U.S. servicemen at the Brink Bachelor. Officers' quarters bombed on Christmas Eve. Imange, Captain Archie C. Kuntz, commander of SAS, awards Purple Heart medals to NAV-Y nurses. From left to right, Lieutenant Barbara Worcester, Lieutenant Ruth A. Mason, and Lieutenant J.J. Darby Reynolds, who were injured in the bombing of the Brink Hotel Bachelor Officers' Quarters on Christmas Eve, 1964. Imange, Secretary of Defense Robert S. McNamara converses with General Lyman L. Lemitzer, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and Admiral Harry D. Felt, Commander-in-Chief, Pacific. Bringing the war to North Vietnam. By 1964, it was clear to many American leaders that the counterinsurgency campaign and limited American military operations would not discourage Hanoi from its sponsorship of the war in South Vietnam. Following the assassination of Diem and his brother Nhu, the Communists launched devastating attacks against the armed forces of South Vietnam, seized control of much of the countryside, and increasingly targeted American military compounds and advisors. Key Navy flag officers proposed various military operations by U.S. forces to temper aggressive North Vietnamese behavior. They considered coastal raids, sabotage, harassment of shipping, small-scale amphibious landings, mining of ports, coastal blockade, aerial interdiction of the Ho Chi Minh Trail, and even airstrikes against the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. In calling for these operations, Admiral Claude Ricketts, Vice Chief of Naval Operations, observed that if the protection of South Vietnam necessitated escalation of the war into North Vietnam, then that must be done, because it is from North Vietnam that the vast majority of the guerrillas are. To focus on North Vietnamese forces operating in Laos, especially along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. By 1964, the 600-mile-long trail had become a major transit route for communist troops and material heading for South Vietnam. Close to 5,000 North Vietnamese and Pathet Lao troops defended the trail that included bridges, way stations, and primary and secondary roadways. Porters carrying backpacks filled with supplies and pushing bicycles loaded down with hundreds of pounds of explosives, ammunition, and weapons pressed forward overcoming. There is hardly consensus about the wisdom of these actions. However, even an armed A-1 Skyraider launches from Aircraft Carrier Ranger, CVA 61, The great fuel and armament capabilities of the propeller-driven planes made them valuable assets in search and rescue missions. Among military officers, Admiral felt fear that a U.S. closure of North Vietnam's ports to ocean-going commerce would prompt Chinese air attacks on the blockading fleet. President Johnson and his chief civilian advisors were equally concerned about the prospect of Chinese or even Soviet intervention. They also feared that hostile acts against the North would stimulate the Communists to increase pressure on the already beleaguered South Vietnamese government and society. To limit the risk of major escalation but still increase pressure on Hanoi, U.S. leaders decided to focus on North Vietnamese forces operating in Laos, especially along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. By 1964, the 600-mile-long trail had become a major transit route for Communist troops and material heading for South Vietnam. Close to 5,000 North Vietnamese and Pathet Lao troops defended the trail that included bridges, way stations, and primary and secondary roadways. Porters carrying backpacks filled with supplies and pushing bicycles, loaded down with hundreds of pounds of explosives, ammunition, and weapons pressed forward over passageways hacked from a jungle. The porters were mountain tribesmen involuntarily pressed into duty and communist troops, fighting disease, starvation, physical exhaustion, and torrential monsoons that often swept in from the South China Sea. The trail porters delivered their precious cargoes to communist forces in South Vietnam, or perished in the effort. Imange, an armed A-1 Skyraider launches from aircraft carrier Ranger, CVA-61. The great fuel and armament capabilities of the propeller-driven planes made them valuable assets in search and rescue missions. Escape from Laos. One of the most memorable episodes during the early days in the Southeast Asian War was the shoot-down and escape from communist captivity in Laos of Navy Lieutenant Charles F. Klussman. The young officer was assigned to Light Photographic Squadron 63 on board aircraft carrier Kitty Hawk, deployed to the South China Sea in June of 1964 as part of Operation Yankee Team. The operation's objective was twofold: demonstrate U.S. resolve to oppose communist actions in Laos by a military show of force and gather low-level intelligence on North Vietnamese forces operating in that mountainous, jungled country. Between May 21st and June 9th, 1964, Navy carrier and Air Force land-based reconnaissance planes completed 130 flights over the plain of Jars and the southern panhandle of Laos. On June 6, 1964, Kitty Hawk launched Lieutenant Klussman's RF-8A photoreconnaissance plane for one more mission. This one over an area of central Laos controlled by Laotian communists, the Pathet Lao. The Americans nicknamed the area Lead Alley because there were so many anti-aircraft weapons positioned there, while making a low-level pass over one site. Klussman's plane was hit by fire from a 37mm anti-aircraft gun and soon became uncontrollable. The naval aviator ejected from his crippled plane and parachute to the ground, all the while under enemy fire. He injured his knee on landing, but managed to radio his compatriots for help. Rescue planes soon arrived on the scene, but because of heavy communist ground fire could not retrieve the downed flyer Pathet Lao. Troops swarmed around the pilot, restrained him, and marched him off to internment. At an isolated jungle camp, his captors physically and psychologically abused him, denied him adequate food, and compelled him to sign a paper attacking U.S. policy in Asia. After some time, the Pathet Lao moved Klussman to another location where pro-American Laotian and Thai soldiers were being held, with the help of fellow prisoners. The Navy lieutenant tried but failed to dig a hole under the wall of their hut. Since the guards didn't discover this attempt at escape, however, the men tried again. Almost 3 months after his capture, Klussman and 5 other prisoners silently slipped out of the camp and into the jungle before the communist guards raised the alarm. 3 of the men went in one direction to an unknown fate, looking for food. A 4th escapee unwisely entered a village that happened to be filled with Pathet Lao troops and probably did not survive this encounter with the agitated enemy. 3 days after their flight from the communist prison camp, the American lieutenant and his last companion Stag geared into friendly lines. Lieutenant Klussman was one of only a few American aviators to escape from captivity in Laos for the remainder of the long war in Southeast Asia. Because of the loss of face with Klussman's successful escape and evasion, the communists in Laos came down especially hard on American aviators who had the misfortune to fall into their hands in later years. Image, a bearded Lieutenant Charles F. Klussman relates the circumstances of his shoot-down, captivity, and escape to Admiral Ulysses S. Grant Sharp, Commander-in-Chief, Pacific, Left, and Vice Admiral Royal Johnson, Commander, 7th Fleet, September 1964. Image, safely on board his carrier, Kitty Hawk, CVA-63, Commander Doyle W. Lynn tells the task force commander, Rear Admiral William F. Bringle, second from left, and other attentive listeners how he survived his shoot-down and recovery. On May 17, 1964, the JCS directed Admiral Fell to initiate low-level reconnaissance/show of forced flights by Air Force planes based in South Vietnam and Navy planes from aircraft carrier Kitty Hawk, CVA-63, Positio. Net its soon-to-be famous Yankee, stationed in the South China Sea, an Operation Yankee Team. The American air units photographed communist military activity in the Plain of Jars area and along the infiltration routes through the panhandle of southern Laos. The communist reaction was not long in coming. On June 6th, anti-aircraft fired down an RF-8A Crusader reconnaissance plane piloted by Lieutenant Charles F. Klussman of Kitty Hawk's Light Photographic Squadron 63. In response to the shoot-down, Secretary of Defense Robert S. McNamara ordered that subsequent reconnaissance missions be escorted by fighter aircraft and authorized them to retaliate against hostile anti-aircraft sites. On June 7th, 3 Kitty Hawk F-8D Crusaders escorting a photo reconnaissance plane carried out just such an attack on an anti-aircraft position in the Plain of Jars. But enemy gunners damaged the jet flown by Commander Doyle W. Lynn of Fighter Squadron 111, forcing him to eject and parachute to Earth. He landed safely in the jungle south of Xin Kuang in central Laos and hunkered down for the night, better prepared than they had been after Klussman's shoot-down. American Search and Rescue, SAR, coordinators immediately dispatched to the scene 4 propeller-driven 1H Sky Raiders that had been in a standby pattern over Da Nang, South Vietnam. Task Force 77 sent another 4 Crusaders and an A-3B Sky Warrior, the latter plane to facilitate communications and pick up Lynn's distress signals. Homing in on these electronic emissions and guided further by the pilot's radio directions and flares, the rescuers located him the next morning. An H-34C Horse helicopter sped to the scene and tried to lower its rescue cable through the forest canopy, but found the trees there too tall. Finally, discovering a small clearing nearby, the SAR team directed Lynn there, swooped down to retrieve him, and whisked the tired but grateful naval aviator to safety. Enraged by Klussman's escape and Lynn's aerial rescue, however, the Pathet Lao guerrillas established such tight and brutal control over their prisoners that, Only a few other men made it out of the Laotian jungle alive in later years. Imange, Vice Admiral Thomas H. Moorer, Commander 7th Fleet. Wright confers with Admiral Ulysses S. Grant Sharp, Commander-in-Chief, U.S. Pacific Fleet, in early 1964. These early operations in Laos revealed what would become the norm during the Vietnam War. Civilian leaders in Washington orchestrating military operations in faraway Southeast Asia. By using the advanced communications equipment of the Pentagon's National Military Command Center, developed to manage America's nuclear readiness posture. Secretary of Defense McNamara could issue specific operational orders to commanders in the field. Admiral Thomas H. Moorer, Commander 7th Fleet, complained privately to the Chief of Naval Operations, Admiral David L. MacDonald, "Oh, your total capability has not been utilized, and we have been restricted as to the number of sorties, have been directed as to the specific type camera to use, and have had late changes in target assignments." For instance, after Lynn's loss, McNamara criticized naval commanders for how they positioned aircraft for the mission and how they armed the planes. Frustrated by the loss of the 2 jets, Washington ordered future reconnaissance missions to be conducted from above 10,000 feet, while out of range of enemy anti-aircraft guns. The JCS also insisted on prior approval of operation plans that would stipulate the purpose, duration, aircraft involved, tactical formation, altitude, and route to the target for each mission. This cautious application of force considerably reduced not only the risk to pilots and aircraft during the rest of 1964, but also the value of the intelligence gained. And it certainly did not send the desired signal of menace to the Hanoi regime. Imange, General William C. Westmoreland, Commander U.S. Military Assistance Command, Vietnam, left. Listens to Captain Paul J. Knapp, Commanding Officer of Amphibious Assault Ship Princeton, LPH-5, during a visit to the warship off South Vietnam. Combat in the Gulf of Tonkin. Washington also decided to increase military pressure on Hanoi from the sea. In January 1964, Admiral Moorer authorized the destroyers of his fleet's DeSoto patrol to conduct all-source intelligence collection operations closer to the littoral of North Vietnam than ever before. Since the inauguration of the DeSoto patrol in 1962, U.S. naval vessels have been instructed to approach no closer than 12 nautical miles to China, North Korea, and North Vietnam. A distance Jenner, ally recognized as the extent of these nations' sovereignty. Early in 1964, however, the State Department ruled that since Hanoi had made no official pronouncement regarding North Vietnam's territorial waters, the U.S. government considered the earlier French 3-mile limit to remain in effect. Moorer lifted the previous injunction against U.S. warships steaming closer than 20 miles to North Vietnam and other Asian communist countries. The 7th Fleet commander enabled his destroyer commanders to operate as close as 4 miles from coastal islands of the DRV. He also agreed to provide General Paul D. Harkins, Commander U.S. Military Assistance Command, Vietnam, COMUSMAC, in Saigon with intelligence that would facilitate raiding and sabotage operations by South Vietnamese commandos on the North Vietnamese coast as part of Operation 34 Alpha, 34A. For 11 days during February and March of 1964, U.S. destroyer John R. Craig, DD-885, moved along the DRV and PRC coastlines in the Gulf of Tonkin gathering intelligence. Moorer scheduled another patrol for late July. In the meantime, the maritime operations of the 34A program suffered numerous setbacks. The Communists defeated or frustrated one South Vietnamese sabotage mission after another. A prime factor in these failed operations was the lack of good intelligence on the enemy. General William C. Westmoreland, Harkin's successor, asked the Navy to provide him with better intelligence on North Vietnamese naval vessels, ground forces, and radar sites along the coast. He was particularly interested in enemy activity around the islands of Hon Mi, Hon Nu, and Hon Mat, where the South Vietnamese intended to operate at the end of July. The new SINCPAC, Admiral Ulysses S. Grant Sharp, who had moved up from command of the Pacific Fleet, called for a DeSoto patrol mission with the primary purpose of determining DRV coastal patrol activity. Image, Admiral Ulysses S. Grant Sharp, Commander-in-Chief, Pacific, in his Pearl Harbor headquarters. Concerned that North Vietnamese defenses had become too robust for commando raids ashore to succeed. McNamara and military leaders directing the 34 in maritime operations opted instead for bombardment missions from the sea. At the end of July, South Vietnamese crewed Nasty-class PDFs followed this new approach when they shelled a gun emplacement, a communications tower, and related buildings on Hon Mi and Hon Nu. As the 4 PTFs returned to their base at Da Nang from that mission on the morning of July 31st, they passed by Maddox DD-731, a Sumner-class destroyer, taking on fuel from a Navy oiler east of the demilitarized zone between North and South Vietnam. The warship, with mission commander Captain John J. Herrick on board, then steamed 34 Alpha Maritime Operations. T.O. convinced the Hanoi government that its sponsorship of the insurgency in South Vietnam could be costly in the early 1960s U.S. Leaders pressed for clandestine sabotage operations against North Vietnam. Admiral Harry D. Felt, Commander-in-Chief, Pacific Command, called for striking the enemy close to home in order to upset some communist apple carts. Felt argued that if such operations resulted in the destruction of railroads, bridges, power plants, and other vulnerable targets, the communists might be restrained from carrying out bombings, assassina, tie-ins, and like actions in the South. Chief of Naval Operations Admiral George W. Anderson agreed that a campaign of harassment against North Vietnam could pay dividends for U.S. policies in Southeast Asia. The first effort launched by the U.S. government, a CIA program employing motorized junks and other craft, was a bust. Successfully operating relatively small, slow, and lightly armed vessels in the often rough waters off North Vietnam proved too difficult. Directing maritime operations was not a strength of the CIA. Hence, in 1962, the Defense Department instructed the Navy to reactivate 2 gasoline-powered aired motor torpedo boats, mothballed in Philadelphia, for potential operations in Southeast Asia. Secretary of Defense Robert S. McNamara also tasked the Navy with purchasing from Norway 2 Nasty-class fast patrol boats. All the boats were classified as fast patrol boats or PTFs. As the boats were being readied, Admiral Felt had his staff draw up a plan for clandestine opera tie-ins against North Vietnam that they identified as SINCPAC Operation Plan 34. The MACV staff in Saigon developed their own plan for operations against North Vietnam, and because they borrowed liberally from the SINCPAC document, they labeled it Operation Plan 34 Alpha. Convinced by the turmoil in South Vietnam following Ngo Dinh Diem's assassination that some new action was needed to restrain Hanoi, on January 16, 1964, President Lyndon Johnson approved the start of 34A. 8 days later, MACV established the Special Operations Group, Later Studies and Observations Group, MACSOG, to run the 34A program, even its maritime aspects. Directly responsible for those maritime operations was the U.S. Naval Advisory Detachment deployed to Da Nang. The naval contingent in Da Nang consisted of Navy officers and men who maintained and repaired the PTFs, and other sailors and Marines who trained the Vietnamese commandos and boat crews that would operate in North Vietnam. The enemy knew through their intelligence sources of this American involvement in the 34A program. Plagued by delays in transportation of the boats to South Vietnam, due to stays of varying length in Norfolk, San Diego, Pearl Harbor, and Subic Bay, mechanical problems, and refitting of armament, removal of the forward 40mm guns from the Nasties, in addition of 81mm mortars and 50 caliber machine guns. The first operation finally kicked off from Da Nang in mid-February. On February 16th, the PDF force landed South Vietnamese commandos on the coast of North Vietnam with the object of destroying SWATO patrol craft at Quang Qui. The clandestine sabotage opera, Thien failed to accomplish this in later missions in the spring, prompting the U.S. ambassador to the Republic of Vietnam, Henry Cabot Lodge, to note that the 34A actions might be good training, but were certainly having no effect on Hanoi. The 34A maritime force registered modest success in June when saboteurs destroyed a storage building and a bridge in southern North Vietnam. On July 1st, 2 PDFs landed commandos who leveled a reservoir pump house with recoilless rifle fire. The team had to fight its way back to the beach, losing 2 men, but aided by 40mm and 20mm fire from the PTFs, managed to re-embark for the return trip to Da Nang. Faced with increasing enemy resistance and coastal defenses, MACSOG leaders decided that future 34A operations should emphasize quick-in, quick-out coastal bombardments by the PTFs. The first of these missions took place on the night of 30 to 31 July when 4 PDFs shelled military buildings on the islands of Han Mi and Han Nu. North Vietnamese shore fire wounded 4 of the South Vietnamese raiders, but enemy patrol boats could not catch up with the fast PDFs as they retired to Da Nang. It was hardly surprising then that North Vietnamese naval vessels attacked U.S. destroyer Maddox when that ship steamed past this hornet's nest around Han Mi and Han Nu on August 2nd, touching off the seminal Tonkin Gulf incident of 1964. The 34A maritime operation would continue for years afterward to harass the enemy on the coast of North Vietnam with limited success. Image: PTF-3 and PTF-4 proceed at high speed off Hawaii. And PTF diagram from Norman Friedman, U.S. Small Combatants. An Illustrated Design History, Naval Institute Press, 1987. Image: Destroyer Maddox, DD 731, 3 months prior to her rendezvous with Destiny in the Gulf of Tonkin. Image: Captain John J. Herrick left, the on-scene commander of the DeSoto Patrol in the Gulf of Tonkin during late July and early August 1964, and Commander Herbert L. Ogier, commanding officer Maddox, along a pre-designated track off the coast of North Vietnam, gathering photographic, electronic, hydrographic, and other intelligence. In the evening on August 1st, Maddox reached a position 5 miles south-east of Han Vat, a small islet close to Han Mi. This was the closest point the destroyer came to North Vietnamese territory during the entire mission. The North Vietnamese monitored the U.S. intelligence, gathering patrol, but took no action against it. In the early morning hours of August 2nd, 1964, however, a communications interception team operating on board Maddox picked up a transmise, Shaun from North Vietnamese Naval Headquarters directing fleet units to prepare for battle and ordering the concentration of forces near Han Mi. Determined not to abort the mission, however, the U.S. Naval Command ordered Herrick to continue his patrol, beginning at 1500 H time or Saigon time. As Maddox headed away from the coast in a northeasterly and then southeasterly direction, her surface search radar picked up high-speed contacts attempting to close with the destroyer. At 1,530, the ship's commanding officer, Commander Herbert L. Ogier, sounded general quarters, and soon afterward Captain Herrick alerted U.S. Naval headquarters of an impending attack and requested air support. By 1600, 3 Soviet-made North Vietnamese P-4 motor torpedo boats, moving at 50-knot speeds, had closed in 800 yards off the destroyer's starboard quarter. While continuing on their hostile approach, the P-4s made no attempt with radio, signal flags, lights, flares, or other means to communicate their intent to the American ship. When 3 warning shots from one of the warship's weapons failed to deter the North Vietnamese. At 16:08, Maddox opened fire in earnest with her 5-inch and 3-inch guns. The enemy boats turned to port, launched torpedoes, fired their 14.5mm guns, and withdrew astern of the destroyer. The North Vietnamese attackers failed to put a torpedo into the destroyer, but one round from a deck gun punctured the ship's superstructure. Gunfire from Maddox shot up one of the boats, killing its commander, and soon afterward 4 Ticonderoga CVA-14 F-8 Crusaders, one of them piloted by Commander James B. Stockdale, a future Vice Admiral and Medal of Honor recipient, arrived overhead. The jets raked the boats with 5-inch Zuni rockets and 20mm cannon fire, leaving one dead in the water and burning from astern. Although badly damaged, the P-4s managed to make it back to the North Vietnamese coast. Maddox retired to the mouth of the Gulf of Tonkin and a rendezvous with the Forrest Sherman-class destroyer Turner Joy, DD-951. Image: the 3 North Vietnamese P-4 motor torpedo boats of Division 3, PT Squadron 135, converge on Maddox during their attack on the American destroyer. Image: an RF-8A Crusader aerial reconnaissance plane flies over carrier Ticonderoga, CVA-14, in the Gulf of Tonkin. President Johnson announced that the destroyer patrol would resume and that the DRV would incur grave consequences if the Communists made another aggressive move against U.S. forces. Admiral Moore, the Pacific Fleet commander, undeterred by the attack on Maddox and determined to assert the right of freedom of the seas, a long-held tenet of U.S. foreign policy, ordered Herrick to continue the patrol off North Vietnam. Maddox, accompanied by Turner Joy, headed back into the Gulf on August 4th. Beginning at 2041 on the dark, overcast night of August 4th, radars on Maddox and Turner Joy picked up high-speed contacts to the northeast. Captain Herrick ordered the ships to move away from what he thought were surface vessels with hostile intent. At 2,239, when one contact was tracked as close as 7,000 yards, Herrick directed Turner Joy to open fire. For the next 2 hours, the U.S. ships, soon joined by aircraft, maneuvered to avoid what the Americans believed were enemy fast attack craft launching torpedoes against them. At the end of the confused nighttime episode, the destroyers reached the entrance of the Gulf and the safety of the fleet drawn up there. U.S. military and civilian leaders began receiving reports of a North Vietnamese attack from the ships and from other sources soon after the first contacts. Herrick sent one message that questioned the accuracy of some of his ship's reports, but this information only temporarily slowed the decision, making progress in Hawaii and Washington. Additional information from Herrick and from intelligence stations in the Far East, however, convinced President Johnson and his chief civilian and military advisors that Hanoi's Navy had again attacked American warships in international waters. The wealth of information available from national and naval intelligence sources and from naval Oper, aiding forces then and for years afterward persuaded many objective observers that the North Vietnamese had attacked the two destroyers. Image, Carrier Constellation, CVA-64, with a full complement of A-4 Skyhawks, A-1 Skyraiders, F-4 Phantom IIs, and other naval aircraft. Heads for combat action off North Vietnam. It is now virtually certain, however, that North Vietnamese naval vessels did not attack American destroyers on the night of August 4, 1964. The National Security Agency intercepted North Vietnamese radio transmissions suggesting an attack. Key eyewitnesses on the ships and an aircraft overhead that night later changed their minds about spotting attacking craft. And the Navy's reports of the operation revealed that some of the information gathered was imprecise or contradictory. Moreover, the Vietnam War has been over for 30 years, and no archival records or personal accounts have surfaced in Vietnam to refute Hanoi's unchanged assertion that its forces did not attack Maddox and Turner Joy that night. Knowing that the Communists had indeed attacked Maddox on August 2nd in broad daylight, however, and persuaded that a similar action had occurred 2 days later, President Johnson ordered U.S. forces to execute retaliatory airstrikes, soon named Operation Pierce Arrow, against North Vietnam at 0800 local time on August 5th. With operational problems and little time to prepare for the mission, aircraft carriers Ticonderoga and Constellation could not launch their planes in time. Just after noon on August 5th, however, Ticonderoga launched F-8 Crusaders, A-4 Skyhawks, and a RF-8A photo reconnaissance plane that joined with a 1H Skyraiders already in the air. These units headed for the oil storage facility at Vinh. Other planes from Ticonderoga set a course for Quang Qui. Less than an hour later, Constellation sent Carrier Air Wing 14 squadrons aloft. Separate groups of propeller-driven A-1 Skyraiders carrying huge loads of ordnance headed for their targets at Hangay and Lac Chau. Later Constellation launched Skyhawk and Phantom II jets that quickly caught up with the A-1s en route to their targets. For the first time in the long Vietnam War, the Navy's carrier air arm projected its power ashore. A strike force of Crusaders, Skyhawks, and Skyraiders under Commander Stockdale roared across the coast near Ha Tin and headed for Vinh. The carrier force flew among the hills that dotted the area to evade North Vietnamese radar and anti-aircraft defenses. In a well-planned maneuver, Commander Wesley L. McDonald's attack squadron, VA-56 Skyhawks, approached Vinh through a valley while the dive. Bombing 1H Spads climbed for altitude before descending on the target. The Crusaders flew along the coast and then turned in toward Vinh at the river entrance to the city. No alarm was raised as the squadrons converged on the fuel tank farm there. At 1,330, the Crusaders roared over the red-tiled roofs of Vinh and let loose with their rockets and 20mm guns against enemy anti-aircraft positions, as did A-4 Skyhawks that emerged from the valley. Their way cleared of potential enemy opposition. The slower 1H Skyraiders of VA-52 and other Skyhawks now dove on the 14 fuel tanks at the facility. 28,000 pounds of bombs and Zuni rockets slammed into the target area. The fenced enclosure erupted in fire and smoke that rose thousands of feet in the air. Minutes after this attack, the carrier force moved onto the nearby Ban Thuy Naval Base to sink or damage 4 North Vietnamese naval vessels. That same day, other Ticonderoga aircraft returned to Vinh to complete destruction of the tank farm and sank another pair of combatant craft at Ban Thuy. The Crusaders attacking Quang Qui to the south also achieved surprise. The F-8s of Fighter Squadron, VF-53, discovering enemy vessels at anchor or attempting to put to sea, holed 5 boats, and sank another with their guns and rockets. At 1540, Constellation's VA-144 Skyhawks reached Hangzhou, where they pounced on Swatow gunboats and other craft in harbor. From shoreside positions and from the naval vessels, enemy anti-aircraft gunners opened up against the aerial intruders. Lieutenant J.G. Everett Alvarez, piloting an A-4, made one pass over the target area, and when he returned for another, North Vietnamese anti-aircraft fire crippled his Skyhawk. Before his plane crashed, Alvarez ejected from the cockpit and parachuted safely to Earth. His squadron mates radioed an Air Force HU-16 amphibian aircraft standing by on SAR alert. When he learned that communist troops were closing on Alvarez's position, however, the on-scene commander called off the rescue attempt. The North Vietnamese troops marched the American pilot off Toa prison cell until his release from captivity in 1973. The dedicated naval aviator endured long years of isolation and torture at the hands of his cruel captors. Image: Operation Pierce Arrow by R. G. Smith. Image: Lieutenant James S. Hardy. Far right, and his squadron mates of Constellation's attack, Squadron 145, get briefed about their mission in Operation Pierce Arrow. Image: Lieutenant J.G. Everett Alvarez Jr. Right. During his release from captivity in North Vietnam in 1973, 8 years after he was shot down during the Pierce Arrow strike of August 5, 1964. Vietnamese troops marched the American pilot off to a prison cell until his release from captivity in 1973. The dedicated naval aviator endured long years of isolation and torture at the hands of his cruel captors. Meanwhile, the A-1 Sky Raiders of VA-145 arrived at Hangzhou and immediately joined the hunt for enemy naval vessels. When the piston-driven planes departed the scene, they left behind a half-dozen shot-up and burning Swatows and other craft. En route to the Lac Chau estuary, the Skyhawks and Sky Raiders of Carrier Air Wing 14 spotted 5 North Vietnamese naval vessels near Han Mi Island and immediately pushed over to attack them. The enemy fought back. Anti-aircraft fire from one of the boats severely damaged the A-1 flown by Lieutenant James S. Hardy. The determined officer continued his attack run, nursed his shot-up plane back to Constellation, and made a successful emergency landing on the carrier. One of his shipmates was not so fortunate. Anti-aircraft fire from one of the boats shot down the Sky Raider piloted by Lieutenant J.G. Richard C. Sather. He was the first naval aviator to be killed in the Vietnam War. Not until 1985 did the Communists return his body to the United States. Despite these losses to the strike formation, the Americans damaged all 5 enemy craft and left several dead in the water. The Pierce Arrow retaliatory strike did serious damage to North Vietnamese naval forces. The 67 U.S. carrier aircraft that took part in the operation sank 7 enemy naval vessels, severely damaged another 10, and put holes in all but 3 of the Swatow gunboats, or PT boats, in the North Vietnamese Navy. In addition to ordering the Pierce Arrow retaliation, the White House encouraged the United States Congress to take appropriate action. Convinced that North Vietnam had carried out a deliberate attack on American naval forces on the 2nd and the 4th of August, Congress approved a resolution proposed by the Johnson administration. On August 7th, the Senate, by a vote of 88-2, and the House of Representatives, in a unanimous vote, passed the Tonkin Gulf Resolution. This measure enabled Johnson to employ the U.S. Armed Forces in the defense of the Republic of Vietnam and the other non-communist nations of Southeast Asia. In essence, it served as the legal basis for fighting the Vietnam War. The Tonkin Gulf incidents, however, worried Johnson that events in Southeast Asia might be spiraling out of control. Hence, in spite of recommendations from Admiral Sharp and other military leaders that the United States maintain pressure on Hanoi, the administration lowered the military presence off North Vietnam. Washington postponed or canceled most of the 34 maritime operations along the North Vietnamese coast for the rest of 1964. The last DeSoto patrol in the Gulf of Tonkin, which involved a 2-day cruise by destroyers Morton, DD-948, and Richard E. Edwards, DD-950, on the 17th and the 18th of September, approached no closer than 20 miles to North Vietnam. The destroyers opened fire on high-speed contacts on the night of the 18th and reported having been attacked, but without conclusive proof. Washington questioned the valid ITY of the report and canceled further operations. Thus, from a military standpoint, the Tonkin Gulf incidents of August did not spark immediate escalation of the conflict in Southeast Asia. On the eve of war, Hun Sen also drew back from actions in South Vietnam that might further inflame the region. On November 1, 1964, the day before the U.S. presidential election, Viet Cong forces shelled an American barracks at Bien Hoa Air Base in the Republic of Vietnam, killing 4 men and wounding 72 others. The president rejected a JCS call for reprisal strikes against North Vietnam. Similarly, Johnson disapproved plans to bomb North Vietnam when communists carried out a sabotage attack on Saigon's Brink Hotel on Christmas Eve, killing or injuring more than 100 Americans, Australians, and Vietnamese. Focused on making his Great Society domestic program a success, Johnson cast about for some way to preserve the Republic of Vietnam while preventing the outbreak of a full-scale war in Southeast Asia. Increasingly convinced that overt conflict with Vietnamese communists could not be avoided, the U.S. military bled efforts to prepare forces for combat in Indochina. In the 6 months after the Tonkin Gulf crisis, the Navy reinforced the 7th Fleet with 15 ships, 1 attack carrier, 3 submarines, 10 destroyer types, and 1 LST, and planned to send another 10. The Navy's Military Sea Transportation Service dispatched passenger, cargo, and tanker ships to the Western Pacific, reactivated ships in the National Defense Reserve Fleet, and chartered U.S. and foreign merchantmen. The Navy also doubled the number of aircraft in the fleet replacement pool and deployed a P-3 Orion Patrol Squadron to the Philippines. Fleet ordnance facilities in the United States shipped improved Sidewinder and Sparrow air-to-air missiles, the new anti-radar Shrike air-to-ground missile, modernized 20mm cannon, and huge stocks of bombs to the operating theater. CB battalions enlarged fuel storage complexes and built additional ammunition magazines, warehouses, hangars, and ship berthing facilities at U.S. Navy installations on Guam, Okinawa, and especially Subic Bay in the Philippines. Naval Intel, Legends commands updated information on potential enemy forces and target sites in North Vietnam. If the Navy needed another reason to get ready for combat in South Vietnam, it was supplied on 16 February 1965. That morning, a U.S. Army officer flying his helicopter along the coast of central South Vietnam suddenly spotted a large, camouflaged vessel perpendicular to the shore. Cargo was being unloaded and stacked on the beach at Vung Ro, an isolated bay on the rocky coast. The pilot immediately radioed his sighting to Lieutenant Commander Harvey P. Rogers, the senior advisor to the South Vietnamese 2nd Coastal District headquartered in Nha Trang, who in turn notified the Coastal District Commander, Lieutenant Commander Ho Van Kai Thoi. Image, Vietnam Nav Y Escort Chi Lang 2, HQ-08. Image, aircraft carriers Ranger, CVA-61, foreground, and Coral Sea, CVA-43, operating at Yankee Station in March 1965. Tho dispatched South Vietnamese 1H Skyraiders to the bay, where their bombs capsized and sank the ship. Additional air strikes pummeled the stores on the beach the next day. But not until 1100 on February 19th were South Vietnamese escort Chi Lang 2, HQ-08, medium landing ship Tien Giang, HQ-405, and submarine chaser Tai Dong, HQ-04, able to overcome command indecision and enemy small arms fire to land their embarked troops and naval commandos. Image, a quartet of attack squadron 155A, 4 Skyhawks from Ranger aloft over the Western Pacific. Image, deck crewmen of carrier Ranger ready in A-4 Skyhawk attack plane for a strike against North Vietnam. What the soldiers and naval commandos, the latter accompanied by U.S. Naval Advisor Lieutenant Franklin W. Anderson, discovered in the wrecked ship and piled up on shore, ended a long-running debate among U.S. military and intelligence officials. The Allies recovered from the 130-foot North Vietnamese ship and from shore sites 100 tons of Soviet and Chinese-made war material, such as 3,500 .400 rifles and submachine guns, 1 million rounds of small arms ammunition, 1,500 grenades, 2,000 mortar rounds, and 500 pounds of explosives. For years, many American analysts had doubted that the Communists were using the sea to supply their forces in the South. Even though it is now clear that Hanoi had developed a major seaborne infiltration program as early as 1963, not until the Vung Ro event were American leaders enlightened. The 7th Fleet Commander, Vice Admiral Paul P. Brick Blackburn, observed that the Vung Ro find was proof positive. He and General Westmoreland called for a major U.S. Vietnamese anti-infiltration patrol operation. The Vung Ro event was one more indication that the nature of the conflict in Southeast Asia was entering a new phase of direct American military involvement. Admiral Moore, the Pacific Fleet Commander, observed to Admiral MacDonald, Chief of Naval Operations, It seems clear that our national policy towards SVN is shifting from one in which we attempted to maintain an advisory image in SVN to one of active and overt U.S. participation. He told MacDonald that his fleet was on the scene with the capability and are ready to go. He suggested his units could provide the South Vietnamese with POW, URFL support in the form of shore bombardment, aerial mine laying, submarine reconnaissance, SEAL activities, over-the-shore logistical support, sea lift, and airstrikes against Viet Cong guerrilla concentrations. He informed the CNO that, unless you feel to the contrary, I will push in this direction. The Navy's top leader did not dissuade his Pacific Fleet commander. Task Force 77. The 7th Fleet's attack carrier striking force, Task Force 77, was the cutting edge of U.S. naval power confronting North Vietnam throughout the war. The aircraft carriers of the task force operated from waters at the mouth of the Gulf of Tonkin between the coast of Vietnam and the Chinese island of Hainan. This operating area, Yankee Station, became one of the most recognizable names of the Vietnam War. Each carrier's air wing consisted of 2 fighter squadrons, 3 attack squadrons, and smaller fixed-wing aircraft and helicopter detachments. The larger ships, the Forrestal-class carriers, operated sometimes close to 100 aircraft, while the smaller World War II-era Essex-class ships had a complement of about 70 planes. During these early years of the war, the F-8 Crusader and F-4 Phantom II served as the Navy's primary fighter planes, while the A-4 Skyhawk and propeller-driven A-1 Skyraiders handled the lion's share of strike operations. Mainstays of the Yankee team reconnaissance missions flown in Laos were the RF-8A Crusader, RA-3B Skywarrior, and RA-5C Vigilante. E-2 Hawkeyes provided the large Alpha Strike aircraft groups with airborne command control, early warning, and communication support. Sikorsky SH, 3C King, and Come On UH, two Sea Sprite helicopters, along with U.S. Air Force aircraft, stood by during carrier strikes on North Vietnam to rescue air crews shot down ashore and at sea. These planes carried a lethal arsenal of bombs, rockets, missiles, and guns. Strike aircraft dropped 250-500-1000- and 2,000-pound general-purpose bombs, iron bombs, napalm bombs, and magnetic sea mines, and fired 5-inch Zuni and 2.75-inch Mighty Mouse rockets. Rounding out the weapons suite were Shrike air-to-surface missiles for taking out enemy radars, bullpup glide bombs, and television-guided walleye bombs. For air-to-air combat, naval aircraft employed the deadly Sidewinder and Sparrow missiles and 20mm machine guns. Essential to the hitting power and the air, surface, and subsurface defense of the ships in Task Force 77 were its assigned cruisers and destroyers. Normally 1 cruiser and 2 to 4 destroyers defended each carrier. The surface warships maintained a protective ring around the carriers and by mid-1965 would be bombarding targets ashore in North Vietnam in Operation Sea Dragon. The 8-inch and 6-inch guns on these ships were as vital to the fleet's projection of power ashore in Vietnam as they had been in World War II in Korea. In short, Task Force 77 packed a considerable punch that U.S. leaders were prepared to employ and did employ in the growing conflict with North Vietnam. Image: a quartet of aircraft carriers surrounded by the cruisers and destroyers of Task Force 77 steam through the South China Sea early in 1965. Image: Rear Admiral Henry L. Miller, Commander Task Force 77, right, and his Chief of Staff coordinate operations from the bridge of Carrier Ranger. Image: Sky Raider prepares to launch from Ranger for a strike against targets in North Vietnam early in 1965, even before U.S. officials considered stopping communist infiltration by sea. They had taken action to interfere with the communist supply lines that wound through eastern and southern Laos. On December 17, 1964, a 1H Sky Raider attacked planes protected by F-4B Phantom fighters and followed by RF-8A photo reconnaissance planes from Carrier Ranger, CVA-19, executed the first Navy armed reconnaissance mission of the Joint Navy Air Force Operation Barrel Roll. The planes were directed to attack communist supply trucks and, if they found none, bomb pre-selected storage buildings, anti-aircraft emplacements, and other military sites. The primary object of this program, however, was a political one, to convince the communists that the United States would use armed force to frustrate their designs on Indochina. When American leaders concluded that the communists probably suffered little from these limited operations, they directed the U.S. forces to cut enemy supply lines at key transportation bottlenecks or choke points. The Mu Gia Pass, which crossed the rugged Truong Son Range bordering North Vietnam and Laos, was the target of the first attack. On February 28, 1965, Sky Raiders and Skyhawks from Coral Sea, CVA-43, executed a massive strike on Mu Gia Pass, followed by an early March attack by Hancock planes. These attacks with delayed action and other bombs cratered the roadways and hindered repair operations, but did not perceptibly slow the truck traffic. By the end of March, carrier planes had carried out half of the 43 barrel roll missions with 134 strike, 28 flak suppress Shaun, 56 combat air patrol, 32 aerial photographic, and 25 escort sorties. However, few American leaders believed that the operation had been or would be effective in discouraging North Vietnam from pursuing its objectives in South Vietnam or Laos. Indeed, Hanoi upped the ante when communist forces mortared an American advisor's cantonment in Pleiku, South Vietnam, on February 7, 1965, killing 8 Americans and wounding 109 others. Image: Lieutenant William T. Majors, rescued by an Air Force SAR plane after he bailed out of a stricken plane over the Gulf of Tonkin in February 1965. Gets briefed in his squadron's ready room for another combat mission several weeks later. In response to this attack, The president finally authorized another retaliatory strike against North Vietnam, the first since the Pierce Arrow operation in August 1964. Johnson approved a one-time, tit-for-tat reprisal strike by Navy, Air Force, and South Vietnamese Air Force units on enemy barracks. That same day, Ranger, Hancock, and Coral Sea dispatched aircraft for strikes on the barracks at Viet Thursday, Lu and Dong Hoi, both just north of the demilitarized zone. Ranger's attack on Viet Thursday Lu was scrubbed because of heavy clouds over the target. The weather was little better at Dong Hoi, but the massed air units of the other two carriers bore in on the compound, home of North Vietnam's 325th Infantry Division. A 29-plane strike formation from Coral Sea approached the target under a low cloud ceiling at 500 knots. The A-4 Skyhawks of attack squadrons VA-153 and VA-155 hit the barracks with rockets and 250-pound bombs, ready in February as they had not been in August of 1964. North Vietnamese anti-aircraft gunners threw up a curtain of fire from 37mm guns, automatic weapons, and small arms ashore and from Swatow gunboats in the Kien River. Some of this fire hit Lieutenant Edward Dixon Skyhawk, but he bravely continued his attack. Soon after, the young naval aviator punched out of his crippled plane, but his parachute failed to open and he plunged to his death. Right behind Coral Sea's formation came Hancock's Carrier Air Wing 21. The 17 Skyhawks of VA-212 and VA-216 dropped their ordnance on already burning and smoking camp facilities as F-8 Crusaders SUP pressed fire from enemy anti-aircraft sites. Completing the mission, RF-8A reconnaissance aircraft rolled in to photograph the scene for naval intelligence analysis. The results were unimpressive. The attack had destroyed or damaged only 22 of the 275 buildings in the camp. Hardly deterred by the American attack, the Communists sent their own message to Washington. On February 10th, Viet Cong Gua Lilat Sabota. The American barracks in Canaan, a port city on the central coast of South Vietnam. The explosion resulted in more dead and maimed Americans. The U.S. response was not long in coming. The next day, Task Force 77 launched a massive one-day strike labeled Flaming Dart 2. Under Commander Warren H. Sells, a force of 99 planes from Ranger, Hancock, and Coral Sea were tasked with destroying the enemy barracks at Chan Hoa, while U.S. Air Force and South Vietnamese Air Force units were directed to hit similar facilities at Vu Con. The Sky Raiders and Skyhawks from the ships to live aired tons of bombs and rockets to the target area at Chan Hoa as F-8E Crusaders and F-4B Phantoms rocketed and strafed enemy anti-aircraft positions. A total of 33 Crusaders, Phantoms, and Sky Raiders protected the attack force should North Vietnamese MiGs based near Hanoi challenge the mission. Image Carrier Hancock and Guided Missile Destroyer Robinson, DDG-12, take on fuel from Fast Combat Support Ship Sacramento, AOE-1, as two other naval vessels bring up the rear in the South China Sea early in 1965. For the next 10 years, the U.S. NAVY would be heavily committed to combat operations in Southeast Asia. Although MiGs did not interfere with the operation, enemy anti-aircraft gunners damaged a Coral Sea A-4C, forcing the pilot to make an emergency landing at Da Nang. Unused bombs, still positioned on the wings, exploded when the pilot landed at Da Nang. Destroying the aircraft, the pilot survived. The pilot of another damaged plane, Lieutenant William T. Majors of EA-153, reached the sea, radioed that he was feet wet, and bailed out. He was soon rescued by an Air Force HU-16. Unable to reach the sea, where SAR units stood by to pluck naval aviators from the water, Lieutenant Commander Robert H. Shoemaker of the F-154 ejected from his stricken Crusader over Chan Hoa. Communist troops swarmed over the landing site, took the American aviator into custody, and dispatched him to Hanoi, where he joined Lieutenant Alvarez in captivity. Even though Flaming Dart 2 destroyed or damaged one-third of the barracks buildings at Chan Hoa, Few civilian or military leaders in Washington believed the one-time strike would cause the communists to abandon their goals in South Vietnam. By now, U.S. leaders were convinced that only a systematic and sustained bombing campaign against strategically vital targets in North Vietnam would compel Ho Chi Minh to forego his campaign to unify Vietnam UND, or the banner of the Communist Party. Hence, on March 2, 1965, 3 weeks after Flaming Dart 2, the U.S. and South Vietnamese Air Forces opened the Rolling Thunder bombing campaign. And on March 15th, the Navy joined in with strikes by massed aircraft from Task Force 77 carriers Hancock and Ranger. Rolling Thunder would continue for more than 3 years. By mid-March of 1965, it was clear to the Johnson administration that the communist leaders in Hanoi, unrestrained and indeed encouraged by their comrades in Beijing and Moscow, were determined to achieve their objectives in Indochina by force of arms. Despite counterinsurgency actions in South Vietnam, carrier deployments into the South China Sea, 34A operations along the coast of North Vietnam, DeSoto patrols, Yankee team, and barrel roll operations in Laos, and retaliatory strikes against targets in North Vietnam, communist activity continued. Armed with an increasing amount of sophisticated Chinese and Soviet weaponry, large units of the North Vietnamese Army were deploying into South Vietnam for a final showdown with the South Vietnamese armed forces and their American patrons. The stage was now set for a full-blown war that would challenge the fortitude of the American people and the U.S. Navy. The author, Edward J. Marolda, has served as the acting director of Naval History and the chief of the Histories and Archives Division of the Naval Historical Center. Designated in December 2008 as the Naval History and Heritage Command, Dr. Marolda has written a number of books on the U.S. Navy's modern experience in Southeast Asia, the United States Navy in the war in Southeast Asia, aircraft carriers, number 4 in the Bantam series, The Illustrated History of the Vietnam War, and Operation N-Sweep, Navy in the Korean War, Naval Institute Press, 2007. A lecturer on military and naval history, he is also co-author of Shield and Sword, The United States Navy and the Persian Gulf War, Naval Institute, 2001, and author of An Illustrated History of the Washington Navy Yard. Holloway III, USN Ret. Vice Admiral Robert Dunn, USN Ret. And Captain Todd Creekman, USN Ret. John Sherwood of the Naval History and Heritage Command's Histories and Archives Division reviewed the manuscript and provided insightful advice on its content and presentation. Many more of my colleagues at the command, too numerous to single out, provided historical support and assisted in the selection of photographs and art. We are grateful to Charlene Marsh, the daughter of R. G. Smith, for permission to use her father's paintings in illustrating this work. Sandy Doyle, my co-editor, was clearly instrumental in bringing this first booklet to fruition, tie-in, and establishing the format and presentation for the series that will reward its readers for years to come. Suggested reading: Hooper, Edwin B., Dean C. Allard, and Oscar P. Fitzgerald. The setting of the stage to 1959. The United States Navy and the Vietnam Conflict, Volume 1. Washington, Naval Historical Center, 1976. Marolda, Edward J. By Sea, Air, and Land. An Illustrated History of the U.S. Navy and the War in Southeast Asia. Washington, Naval Historical Center, 1994. Marolda, Edward J. and Fitzgerald, Oscar P. From Military Assistance to Combat. 1959 to 1965. The United States Navy and the Vietnam Conflict, Volume 2. Washington, Naval Historical Center, 1986. Moyer, Mark. Triumph Forsaken. The Vietnam War, 1954 to 1965. London, Cambridge. University Press, 2006. Shredley, Richard L. From the Rivers to the Sea. The U.S. Navy in Vietnam. Annapolis, Naval Institute Press. 1992.